How's it going, folks? It's Juno here. Today I want to talk a bit about evolution, but I want to describe it in a way that perhaps isn't normally considered because it maybe falls a bit outside of the general definition. But I want to see evolution as kind of what's its engineering function in the continuum of existence. How does evolution work in that way? And I don't just want to look at biological evolution. I kind of want to have a bit of a discussion about evolution from like a technological and a sociological perspective as well, and the greater impacts involved. So the reason I'm talking about evolution today is because we're at a stage in our development where we're looking at engineering things genetically. And sometimes we have to look back and identify, well, the main mechanism we have right now to kind of engineer things genetically is twofold. It's like a brute force version, which is we just turn genes on and off and see what they do. But there's like millions of lines of code. It takes a very long time to do it by running models. And the other version is to see where a code exists in nature already, that we've got it mapped, and find out what its function is there, and then just extrapolate that and copy it over. So one really well known example of this is this experiment with mice, where they were able to genetically modify the mice, and they would take a normal form of mouse and then boost its genes for muscle growth, and then the genetically modified mouse would have these huge muscles naturally. And clearly, all right, let's look at this from like a historical perspective. Like, whenever you want something to be the best of something, you always look for like the extremes. And the notion of like a super soldier has been something that's been dreamed about for thousands of years. This idea of being able to take just the perfect attributes for a specific role and combine them and get out this ideal form. And it kind of says a lot about the culture when it identifies what those ideal forms are as a representation of that society. Even though, obviously, like I said, it's kind of a trade-off. You're really just picking out a certain role and accentuating the properties for that role. So the obvious here would be like, wow, couldn't we just make like every person like super strong? Couldn't we give everybody super strength? Wouldn't that be like a superpower? And the truth is there's drawbacks to this. There are huge drawbacks to this. The calorific requirements of a very dense, large muscle mass mouse is a lot higher than the calorific requirements of a normal mouse, which means that it requires a different ecosystem entirely to support it. And in natural ecosystems, you basically have to evolve to adapt to them. It's only when you start getting into the artificial ones, where you're able to like design high calorie, high protein foodstuffs, and then mass produce them to support this new design, this new format of animal. So in nature, you wouldn't usually select for these things. However, in an artificial environment, you absolutely could and derive the benefits, but it's a trade-off because then you need to have different technologies supporting it, right? It becomes like a Formula One car. Everything works and works at its highest performance, but it's with an incredibly low tolerance. They're not very robust. They can't take a lot of changes. They only operate in one specific mode. And this is the thing. It's like nature tends to select for robustness. Not accentuating individual attributes unless there's a very specific advantage in evolution to do so in local competition. So this is where you get this really interesting aspect of going, well, is designer genetics what we really want then? Because we will need to supplement the entire population with a new ecosystem to support their higher or more their variable requirements, right? So if we take the example of the mouse, having this now hugely higher calorific intake, I mean, you just take a look and see what bodybuilders eat, for example. Like, they're like meal prepping days in advance, and they'll make like 8 meals for the day. And each of those meals will be like a small regular meal for a normal person, and it'll have very specific things in it. I know everyone knows about the fish and a rice cake thing. Like, will undertaking like designer babies lead to the demise of sea life? These are the things you have to consider. If all we have is fish and rice cakes, that's going to mean a lot of fish need to be caught to support all these people with their huge appetites now. So it's a very interesting way of looking at it. I mean, you could alternatively look at it slightly differently and say, well, there are some evolutionary paths that maybe we don't want to follow because we don't have to engineer our environment. And one instance of that you might look at is things like lipid tissues, right? So fats. If you consider carefully why fats exist, their functions and their advantages in a natural environment, you can see how they've evolved in lots of different instances, and to greater or lesser degrees, right? So you have some creatures that have very simplistic fat storage or fat utilization methods, and then you get some critters that have incredibly sophisticated, even organs devoted to the management of fat. So, I mean, if you were to reverse that and say, well, if it wasn't fat, it was something else, most of us don't really need to store water. Okay, in the spaces that we've evolved in, the availability of water has always been somewhat constant with the population at the time. I mean, for most of us, water falls out the sky, literally. So the need to store it is pretty minimal. So evolution isn't going to waste resource on developing that skill or selecting for it, for that adaptation. However, there are a few animals that do develop adaptations around the retention of water, like camels, for example, because of the environment they exist in and the advantage it gives them to procreate. Well, you need to survive before you can procreate, so survival obviously comes first, procreation second. But then as you get more advanced and certainly complexity increases, you then look at societal organization and what sort of game theory derived benefit you can have from certain organizations in society. And they then form an additional abstraction layer of evolution, and that's where most of our sort of conflict over the direction of our society is on today. Is trying to figure out the best calibration of the organizations we have, of our individual roles and our societal aims and objectives, and then finding out where the values lie within that, and then establishing them in some way in our society so that we can see if we can derive that sort of game benefit, that game theory benefit. But the problem is, obviously, is like evolution has the same themes in every abstraction layer. So just as you can have a gene that codes for greater resistance to the bubonic plague will then give you bowel cancer when you're older, equally you can code for societal institutions and values that prioritize for compassion for the disadvantaged now, potentially at the sacrifice of a loss of opportunity, so an opportunity cost on the investment you could have made for the betterment of society in the long term. And this is something we need to look at, because evolution, as I said, prioritizes the short term. Okay, it always will. And if evolution has a hand in every layer, it's really up to us where we're able to manage that hand, manage the influence that it has on what layer. And is the layer of social structures and social institutions the layer in which we kind of step in and say, all right, this is where evolution should have minimal effect, and we'll counteract for it specifically. And therefore we won't necessarily go with the most sympathetic short-term group benefits, and we'll go for the longer-term ones that do appear out of touch with certain values. Nevertheless, they end up benefiting the group more in the long term. I mean, this is a classic question, right? Like, the good we can do today is offset by the opportunity cost of the good we could have done, perhaps to a greater degree, even logarithmically, like factors, powers of more effective goodness in the long term. But we have to get to the long term first, so it's a kind of bird in the hand versus two in the bush argument, which I don't believe is true. It's a very short-term strategy to imagine, after seeing how long we've been around for, that it's all going to end if we're not charitable right now. Right? I don't think that's the case at all. And if you are a student of history and you can somewhat... It is obviously... You can be skeptical of history and its interpretations, and you can say, well, there's nothing to say that I didn't start existing 2 minutes ago and all my memories are just implants. Then sure, then I could understand. If you're going to argue from that perspective, I can understand always going with the shortest term arguments, the shortest term benefit arguments. But if you don't subscribe to that in your life, and you're not hypocritically, not just to win the argument, but actually really your behaviors match that, if that's not the case, then you really should be, you're semi-agreeing already with the long-term investment arguments. But then again, we live in a world of hypocrites, so it's always difficult to say, and holding people to account is becoming more and more difficult as time goes on, especially with the notion of sort of a post-truth society where it's all subjective, it's postmodernist subjectivism, and we're just seeing things as personal truths rather than as objective truths. So without any notion of order in the world, that is objective order outside of ourselves, and just interpretations of subjective order, which is in fact chaos, actually, if you define it in that way, where it's only order to the individual, to nobody else. therefore it's essentially a kind of chaos. Then of course, again, short term is always going to appear like the better argument. But going back to the genetics then, I want to identify also just a little bit about the technological aspect of evolution. Now, we know that technologies evolve. And again, often the evolution is one of losing robustness and gaining specific function. So if you're designing, let's say you're designing a gun, right? You want to design a gun as different materials are invented or discovered. You can then begin to construct the gun differently. Now, at a time when you had like things like bayonet charges and cavalry and pike formations, having a very heavy weapon that multitasked one as a firearm and secondly as a club or as a spear, you'd understand that you'd want quite a heavy implement. However, now we have plastics and we don't really engage in melee that much in a combat environment. So having a heavy weapon has lost its dual function effectiveness. And in fact, creating a weapon out of plastic seems much more viable and even advantageous, because now you're reducing the long-term disadvantage of like a heavy weapon that you have to lug around everywhere, with a much more convenient, smaller, lighter form factor, with an increase into the potential of the other side of being, very immediately effective in a firefight. And you can look at the disposable element of it as well. So if you're of a disposable ecology, and you consider that having things immediately convenient, easy to produce, but not long-lasting, differs a very immediate benefit, then I can absolutely see why you maybe don't need to build buildings that last for 600 years, right? I mean, because it goes with the pace of change. If I built a church 1,000 years ago out of stone, the technology was not moving anywhere. So in fact, that would serve virtually the same function at a very comparable relative efficacy 500 years later, 700 years later. Like, it still would have performed its function well without much changing. So building robustness and longevity into things made a lot of sense then. But as the pace of technology changes, building robustness into things actually can be seen as a missed opportunity for engineering it better. All right, so you offset something. You could have made it lighter. You could have made, because let's say, like, if you make things heavy, that also means that anything that carries it has to be more robust. That means that anything that handles it has to be stronger. That means that anything that interacts with it has to be under greater load duress. So in a way, you're bringing in a factor of disadvantages for the one advantage of robustness, of making it stronger and less likely to break. And in exactly the same way, it's just like making all the people stronger through genetic manipulation. Now there's no fish, right? Now the load on the food production side of things is so much higher, so you can't maintain it. So actually the drawbacks are much larger than the advantages. And that's why you don't evolve very often these super strength mice, because the mice, its longevity is actually more benefited from its lower calorific requirements. And that keeps it around longer for the genome to continue trying to reproduce itself or replicate itself. And that's the end goal, really. I mean, if you're looking at us even now, live forever is kind of where the objective is, and you see it in religiosity with the notion of eternal life. Okay, like that's still a lot of people's ambition. Obviously, we're under greater distraction now, and we see the idea of immortality as being immortality of the physical being, perhaps less realistic, but immortality of the consciousness or intellect, something else. We then look for other avenues out of that equation. But it's similar in in trees, for example. So I want to talk about paper in a minute, but I'll just start with trees. So you have these kind of evolutionary shortcuts sometimes. And it's really down to the environment, mostly. But you have to include the other actors, the other animate objects inside the environment, because they all are impacting on the individual. So the environment shouldn't be restricted to just the constituent particles of the air, the relative temperatures, the availability of certain materials. No, it should also include the psychological stresses, the prey-predator relationship, all kinds of things that are influencing the behaviors of the individual actors. Those are the constituents of the environment. And then in that case, you can look at every evolutionary move as an interaction of the environment, or an impact of the environment. So, wood, right? So you have often these two types of wood, right, in trees. You have softwood and hardwood. And I know that there's some classification differences where you get like convergent evolution, where a couple of things do things the same. Will it be coincidental? Anyway, you'll have a situation where in areas where there's like low sunlight availability, you'll have these very long-lived trees because there's no opportunity for them to gain immediate advantage when they're very young by spreading out loads and sucking in all the sunlight and blocking out sunlight for other plants, and therefore gaining a local monopoly. All right, but then in areas where like it's more temperate, you will get more softwoods, which are not as strong and lighter, molecular concentration is less. All these factors that essentially mean, like, if you needed to burn wood as a fuel, for example, you'd need to use more softwood fuel than you would hardwood, because hardwood is the particles themselves are closer together. There's less gaps. There's less air. It's just it's it's more condensed matter. But that gives it a bunch of advantages. Okay, because then you get these trees that are super strong, very long, very high longevity. Great resistance to disease. They become long-term habitats for other creatures. They become there's symbiotic relationships going on between different creatures in that sort of biome, and it also changes the soil ecology and everything like that. Yet with the softwoods, what you get is like a very high plumage near the bottom of the tree. When it's just starting out, it kind of spreads as much as it can. It wants that immediate advantage, so it doesn't have these slow saplings that take a very long time to develop and turn into trees hundreds, thousands of years old. You get these like trees that grow basically overnight, like 5 to 10 years, and you'll have a tree that's as big as a house. But as I said before, the lignin and everything else, and cellulose in the tree trunk itself, will actually be much further spaced apart. It'll build up concentric layers much faster, but it'll be of lower density, and it'll have all kinds of like immediate problems, and the turnover rate will be much higher, so many more of the plants will fail, but a few of them will get through, and there's so many being put out at once in terms of the seed distribution, so you won't have like these one big thick acorn seeds. You'll have like these pine cones where there's like 50 seeds in a single cone, and they all get distributed quickly, and they can all settle in like very inspecific conditions, and they just give it a go, right? And with invasive species, what you'll have then, like the lionfish, is you have things that have been bred in a certain environment that are more adept in very specific ways, transported into a new environment by some means or another, usually by some kind of interference. But I'm sure climate disasters and like tectonic movements and stuff like that, I'm sure that can all contribute to it as well. Even changing sea temperatures might be able to affect where certain things can begin to live, and then they can outcompete what's local. Because the way evolution functions, the process means that you only have to be good enough, and then there's like a window of acceptance beyond just good enough where you're liable to find all of the adaptations. However, when something has evolved down a line of specification very highly, at the cost of other things, clearly, but still this specific way. And for the lionfish, for example, it would be like their poisonous spines and their very varied diet they can have, so they can literally eat like anything that's out in the new biome, and they can just take over the local ecology because they're able to. They don't have like very specific co-evolutionary partners that they've kind of preyed upon just them, and they've developed very specific kind of like digestive process just for a certain creature. They have like a very broad one, and they have this great defense where they're not really easy to be eaten, and a lot of things in the new environment don't know about them, so they don't know how to tackle them, they're not involved with them. So as I said, these can be like evolutionary shortcuts, right? So then a new trait gets introduced, and then it completely changes the landscape of the local evolution. However, clearly this in itself has problems, because there may be factors that are not yet considered. There's no balance to begin with, so when the lionfish eat everything, they will starve and die. So it's without that balance, clearly that's an inbuilt sort of stop point, where you even need to think about that for us as well sometimes, like how far down the line until it becomes an endemic problem. And with the lionfish, we know at the rate they reproduce, and with their lack of natural predators, and with all the food sources they now have, the invasive species is going to be very successful for a period, but that population will crash at some point because they'll either outcompete themselves, so there'll just be too many of them to be held up by the resources in the area, or a number of other solutions that could come out to the problem. The problem is the cost before that steps in. So before that natural break comes on, are we going to lose too much or irreversibly lose other things? And these are prompts for intervention. Like, when do we intervene? And also we need to look at ourselves and say, are there paths we're on already that actually that are endemic and we will not be able to escape the ramifications of? But it's so delayed that we have no idea of it yet, and we're just hurtling towards it. That's a very interesting philosophical thought, I think, and I've considered it sometime in the past. So going back to evolution then, we were looking at hardwoods and softwoods. And what I think is very interesting is that, woods make paper, and paper, while there was written language before paper really made an explosion of the written language so that more people were pressed into becoming literate. And what I think is very interesting about literacy, I think it's actually very bad technology. When you consider it, if I'd have written a paper with all the things I'm saying right now, it would have taken you longer, most likely most people would have taken longer to read the paper than it would just to listen to me. Because you can even speed me up on YouTube, put me at double times, whatever, you can listen to the whole discussion in like 15 minutes or half an hour. Whereas if I'd written this all on paper, much longer time to read the paper unless you're a very fast reader. So on the outside of it, there are definite drawbacks to reading and writing. Literacy is kind of a trash technology at the outset, right? In the short term, literacy isn't a very effective technology. The oral tradition is much stronger, which is why it survived for so long, even though there were systems for writing thousands of years ago. They were only used in very specific circumstances, yet they're ubiquitous today. You can find them everywhere. Why is it? And I think it's the long-term benefits of writing are quite clear. So in the short term, writing's a bad technology. It doesn't work, it doesn't help, and it's inferior, so you wouldn't want to use it for most things. Also, it's not interactive either. However, writing has a few advantages. So the oral tradition is subject to change over time. People recount the story differently. They put their own interpretation on it. There are ways it can the story can be amended and adapted. So you're losing fidelity in the message, all right? And that can be extremely important over long periods of time to find out what was the original message and not the convoluted, distorted thing you're receiving. Another thing is so it's not just the preservation of the message, it's the storage aspect of it as well, and it's the way that you can tell it to people in such a way that everybody receives the message the same. So I can recount a story 5 days in a row. I might tell the story mostly the same, but there may be some small inferences that I make, and people pick up my body language. And this is again another thing is literacy it lacks a lot of bandwidth, right? It lacks a lot of bandwidth because you can't inference a lot of what somebody's saying from their. You can inference a lot of what someone's saying from their body language and the way they manipulate their voice and their tonality. It can tell you a lot about what's being said, and writing doesn't contain any of that, which in a way is like probably why it's so appealing to autistic people, because they're already taking in information at such a high data rate that being able to restrict it down to just the pertinent information in the words is very valuable for them. Because as I understand it, autism somewhat is a dysfunction of being able to prioritize information correctly. So you end up giving all information that you're intaking the same priority, and then you're trying to pay attention to too many things at once, and you become overwhelmed. And that's where the frustration of autism is in individuals who have it. This constant trying to just escape from overwhelming situations and trying to avoid sort of additional information where it's not necessary. But yeah, this is a huge problem. But when it comes to writing, you don't have all that additional information. You just have the most basic parts of it. So while there's a huge loss of information in the message, it's highly refined. And that is both a disadvantage and an advantage at the same time. It really depends on the context. But again, you can see why that may have contributed in the short term, very low push for literacy. Like, people would have thought it was really unnecessary, and it really isn't. However, once you have that tool of literacy, you're then able to access information from far further than just your local people who can tell you stuff. from your local community. You can now read books from anywhere in the world, read a document, see it online, whatever. You can now access all this kind of information without having to be told it directly by somebody you know. And that's the thing, like, there's a lot said about like secret schools and esoteric information, but this is probably the freest time of information we have now, because you don't need the trust of somebody to tell you something. You can literally just go online and find it. That doesn't mean that you should give it absolute veracity and sort of say, this can't be. This is a huge problem in today. Is that Google has a level of authority we haven't seen in hundreds of years. Google has a level of authority where people will check their own beliefs against what Google says and side with Google. All right. That is insane to me. That is absolutely insane that you would hand over so much authority to either an algorithm or Google's a company, right? It's a company. Hand over all your authority to this company and say, all right, if Google told me this, if I searched it on Google and this was the result, I was wrong, Google was right. And I'm not saying that the problem is it's a pattern of behavior. Like, they've repeatedly seen these instances of where they didn't know something and Google told them something and it was mostly correct. And there have been a couple of times where they weren't sure, or they thought they were sure, and Google corrected them. And that, I understand that they're establishing the evidence shows that from their experience, Google's mostly been right, so Google probably is right. Okay? The problem comes in when they lose sight of the perspective that shows you can still be right yourself, and Google can still be wrong. Google is still being programmed by people, as far as we know. It is still a company that has shareholders and an agenda and board meetings and everything like that. There is input, there's human input into what goes into the way Google presents information to you and what gets presented. And it's kind of like that moment in Star Wars where Obi-Wan's looking for a system and then it's like, but it's not there. And then he goes, oh, the records must be incomplete. And it's so shocking to the curator that someone would believe the records are incomplete. They just say, no, if it's not there, if the records don't have it, then it simply doesn't exist. Clearly, that's not the case. That is not the case. The representation of something and the thing itself are two different things, all right? So you cannot just say, because it's been represented to you in this way, that is the absolute truth. Maybe the absolute truth is you can't know, because you can never interact with it. However, determining absolute truth from a position of something that represents it, signals that, I think is a huge folly. And you need to calculate that in slightly and just remain a little skeptical. That doesn't mean abandon Google and never believe it. I think it's very well founded in most of its precepts. But you need to temper that belief with, it can still be wrong. It can still be wrong. And don't adhere to that just because it's emotionally comforting to think that... I mean, I was thinking about this earlier. I was thinking, like, here's the thing. Let's say that there were two political parties, right? And one political party literally had all the correct answers. They had them. All their policies were correct. Do you think that would mean no one would join the opposition? Right? Do you think that would mean no one would ever join? I would say, more than likely, a lot of the things that are correct are not to people's palate. They don't want the correct. They want what they want. And so I think you would have a lot of people who would end up joining the opposition, clearly because it's their only other option. And I feel like that's a huge indicator on where we are today with things like conspiracy theories, is that there's the global consensus. People for a while were sort of, they were Google strong on it, like this is the truth and there's nothing else. And now the fact is we're allowed to be more skeptical. We've kind of somehow broken out of the dogma of the scientific community, and now we're like, okay, we understand it's organizations, it involves human individuals, and they can be fallible, so some of the things they come to, the conclusions they come to, and the assertions they draw on others can be fallible as well. And because we can now engage with that, you then get the obvious side of, well, something science said I didn't like, therefore I'm going with the other side, right? Now there's another side. You're able to take it, and that's not just in conspiracy theories, that's in a lot of things. Some things that I don't even want to talk about because this isn't a political channel. But there are some things that have extremely strong scientific evidence. But the fact we're now allowed to think, or we've come to the point where it's socially acceptable to disagree with scientific consensus, means that on the one hand you get conspiracy theories, on the other hand you get, well, other things. And they're very attractive and they gain a lot of support despite having very little evidence outside of circumstantial or individual anecdotes. Or just, again, the basic skepticism of the scientific institutions. Like that is enough sometimes to point people in the way of, I'm not going to side with them because they could be wrong, it shouldn't be that strong. You need to remain skeptical, but don't go to the point of opposing everything because you're skeptical of it. That is clearly too far. It's a reservation of judgment that you should try to maintain. That's probably the ideal medium. All right. So I've spoken a bit about technological evolution, how literacy is actually in short form, a poor evolutionary choice. However, there is some benefit to it, and through its mass implementation, that small investment in your time and energy in developing literacy skills enables you to potentially do quite a lot of other things that may not have been available to you before. So it's worth that biological investment. I've talked obviously about biological evolution, and hopefully I've even touched on there a bit of societal evolution as well. So again, how the institutions change over time, and how that plays into all of evolution essentially is trying to play into what's the best combination or balance of risk versus reward. It's the investment balance essentially, and that is driven by the desire to continue. It's this very, when I begin to think about this, I kind of get a little bit lost in thought about what does it all mean. Okay, one of the old big questions, like, what does it all mean? Is it just that keeping the lights on? Is that the whole point? Just keep the lights on. Just keep the lights of the universe on. Keep the lights of life on. Just keep the lights on. And on some level, I feel like maybe we are in a global, universal battle between entropy and existence. And it's like, well, if there's only a certain timer on this, if we don't figure out a way out of this entropy disaster, everything is basically going to be over. And it obviously it doesn't sound like a pressing issue right now, but I think it's kind of the same notion that the environmentalists have. They're just too small scale thinking. They're just thinking about keeping the lights on Earth. And I think, well, no, you need to think about keeping the lights on in the universe, actually. We need to find a way to counteract entropy. Counteract empathy, that's what I want, if I can. Alright, but I'll have to do that in another video. That's far too big for this. I might go for a walk and do that one, actually. I hope I've spoken a little bit about evolution and how it's actually more trade-offs than benefits, and you need to count that into things. When you think about evolution and you start going off the deep end on everything we could become and everything that could be possible and those kinds of things, I think you need to very quickly realize the level of engineering that's going to be required outside of the genetic stuff. You know, when you're now thinking about, okay, well, how do we engineer the food availability situation? How do we engineer the environment to support us as now being like 9 foot tall? How do we engineer the environment to offset the lack of robustness we'll have if we go down certain avenues? And yeah, you can look at that even in a business perspective. You could, if you were like a very sort of cash flow heavy business and you had very little liquid reserves, you could see it that way and go, well, okay, we're actually not so robust, but we're very highly tuned to our market. Therefore, we have a distinct advantage and we may be able to outcompete our competitors. All right. Thanks very much for staying with me on this one, lads. Have a good one.